Now, the tech world kicks off this week with a major departure at Twitter. Co-founder and CEO Jack Dorsey is stepping down at the social media company. He will be succeeded by the Chief Technology Officer, Parag Agrawal. In a press release, Jack Dorsey said that he decided to leave Twitter because the company is, quote, ready to move on from its founders. What is the story behind this move? Joining us now from Denver is Kurt Wagner, who covers the big social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Snap for Bloomberg News. Kurt, thank you so much for joining us. It's always great to see you. Let's take a step back here. Give us the quick take on why Jack Dorsey is leaving the company that he co-founded.
Yeah, I mean, this is a bit of a surprise to me, just because he has been back at Twitter for about 6 years, and a lot has happened in that time. There have been a lot of kind of roller coaster moments for him, where you might have expected him to leave, and it kind of feels like Twitter has made it through the other side, so to speak. You know, they are shipping products a little bit faster. There were some activist investors who joined the board about a year and a half ago and kind of wanted Jack Dorsey to leave. And they've even said, you know, Jack's doing an okay job. So it's kind of an interesting time, but at the same time, maybe that's why he is stepping down now. Maybe he feels like Twitter is finally in a bit of a good place, where he can leave and feel confident that things are going to continue. So, you know, there's a lot to unpack here, of course, but it is definitely an interesting move that caught me by surprise, to be honest.
Well, there are a lot of people questioning, and I know that it's going to take a lot more reporting and some time and distance to determine the answer to this. Was he pushed or did he jump? And I guess one way we can kind of try to answer that question is to look at it from the different constituents, investors, employees, users, and advertisers. Who would want him out? Who would want him to stay?
Well, one thing we know is that even if he was pushed, it was very coordinated, right? I mean, they have a new CEO that they announced this morning. So it wasn't as if Jack is stepping away and they're doing some big CEO search, right? So there was a plan in place. But as you pointed out, and as I mentioned, there were some activist investors who took seats on Twitter's board last year. At the time, they were very unhappy with Twitter's business performance. You know, certainly wasn't growing in the way that peers like Facebook or even a Snap might be growing. And so there was this feeling that Twitter was underachieving. And for a while during the pandemic, things got better and user growth was really strong and business growth was strong. The last couple of quarters, Twitter hasn't been quite as strong. It's possible that this could finally be catching up to them and that maybe they said, hey, listen, you know, Jack Dorsey, it's time for you to leave. But I think that if you're an investor, this might be a move that you like, because while people generally like Jack, the company has not really performed the way that a lot of other social media companies have over the last 5 years during his tenure.
And one way to judge that is by looking at the share price of Twitter versus Square, which Jack Dorsey was also running. He was CEO of two companies at the same time, which really puzzled a lot of people because they're saying, how could you do both jobs well? And if you're an investor in Square, you were pretty happy because look at that. The stock is up 1,608% over the past 5 years. Twitter, which is the maroon line at the bottom, has risen only 157% in the past 5 years. In practice, Kurt, do we know which company he prioritized more?
Well, what I find kind of funny here is that the story has always been this feeling that Jack's true love was Twitter. And that while he was, you know, more successful at Square's where he's made most of his money, his personal net worth, that there were feelings that from Square employees and Twitter employees over the years that he would eventually choose Twitter, that's where his heart lies. But what we have seen over the last year or so is that he's really, really into crypto. He's really big into Bitcoin. He's really into decentralization. And so in some ways, it does make sense that he might stay with Square because there's a lot of opportunity there with finance and changing the way that people spend and share money between each other. And so I think maybe that aligns more with his personal passions now than maybe people realized a few years ago.
Gotcha. One thing that I've read about is that Jack Dorsey tended to be pretty much hands-off. He delegated a lot of the decisions to his staff. So do we understand which kinds of decisions he led versus those he kind of left to his team? For instance, the idea that he would not allow Donald Trump, the former president, to be on Twitter? Was that his call, or was that something that his team had to really push him towards? Also, the fact that he blocked New York Post links to Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, before the election. Is that something that he spearheaded, or was he pushed into that position by the rest of his team?
So he is an incredibly hands-off CEO, and it cuts both ways. Some people say, hey, this is what you have to do if you're running two publicly traded companies, right? You can't be in the minutia of every single decision because you just don't have the time in the day to do that. And so he did step back. He empowered the people who reported to him to make decisions. The counterpoint there is like, well, hey, you're the CEO, right? You should be making these decisions. Sometimes we need you to make these decisions. And he didn't always want to do that. And so the Donald Trump one is a good example at Twitter. It was said and by people who were there and involved, they said that Jack was not involved in that decision. He was alerted that the company was going to do what it did in terms of suspending the president, but that it wasn't ultimately his call, right? And you can compare that to what happened at Facebook, where Mark Zuckerberg is just incredibly involved in those types of decisions, very different styles there. And so I think that tends to work when you are running two publicly traded companies. It kind of is a necessity, but how long can you sustain that? At a certain point, doesn't Twitter deserve a full-time CEO? Doesn't Square deserve a full-time CEO? I think a lot of investors believe the answer is yes.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you look at the reach that Twitter has versus some of the other social media platforms that you cover, I mean, daily active users is pretty small for Twitter. It's 211 million as of the third quarter. That's less than Snap, which is at 306 million. And of course, Facebook is the behemoth, right? 1.93 billion users. So Jack Dorsey, hands-off CEO, was kind of considered a stabilizing force at Twitter, but maybe he was too stable. Maybe he was just kind of preserving the status quo, and Twitter missed a chance to do a lot of innovative things that could have really grown their reach.
Well, I think Twitter has always struggled with identifying what it is and who it's for, right? And I think the reality is that it's for news junkies. It's for people like me who are journalists who are in the news all day long, who care about getting live updates immediately about things that are happening in the world. And some people are like that, but most people are happy to get their news at the end of the day from, the local news station, or they'll, open the newspaper in the morning and that's that. They don't necessarily need those live updates. And I think the other thing that's in a way helped and hurt Twitter, it's helped it from a brand perspective, but hurt it from a user perspective, is just the public nature of tweets, right? When President Trump was using Twitter, everyone knew what he was tweeting, whether you had a Twitter account or not, because of how public it is. And so I think that, again, is something that helped the brand, but didn't necessarily help the user base, because you didn't have to sign up to get a lot of value from the company. Yeah. And if you're not signed up, obviously you're not seeing ads, you're not really contributing to the revenue.
Gotcha. Yeah, so in many ways, Twitter was influential, but then you look at the user base and it's not really so influential because of that public nature. I just look at a recent Pew Research Center poll that showed that only 23% of U.S. adults use Twitter, and that hasn't really changed that much since 2018. By contrast, you look at YouTube, 81% of U.S. adults use YouTube, 69% of U.S. adults use Facebook. I mean, Twitter has a smaller share than LinkedIn or Snapchat or Pinterest or Instagram. I know that you've written recently as a news junkie about the new Twitter paywall. It's called Twitter Blue, that gives you some premium products for a subscription. Does that change the purpose of Twitter for someone like you, or is that an initial move towards Twitter doing more things to really hone in on that very specific audience that does rely on it?
Yeah, I think that's an example of Twitter recognizing, okay, who are our power users? Who are we building for, right? We are building for those news junkies, and therefore we're going to give them kind of extra features that most people wouldn't pay for, but those diehard users probably will. And so that seems to be where they're leaning in. Now, to your point about the percentage of adults who use Twitter, I would guess it's higher in the sense that more people probably see tweets, they get news from tweets. They just don't necessarily realize it, right? Maybe they're not logged in, but they're getting tweets on the TV, or other people are building news stories based off of things that have been happening on Twitter. So while not as many people, again, have accounts, I do think that the influence is still pretty significant. It's just how do you make money from that? And Twitter has, admittedly not done as good of a job of building a business around it as they need to.
Gotcha. All right. Well, one person we haven't really talked that much about is the incoming CEO. It's actually effective immediately, so I should just call him the CEO now. Former CTO Parag Agrawal. What do we know about what he brings to the table, and how much free reign will he have? Because he will not be the chairman of the board. That's going to be an independent director, Brett Taylor, who's going to be the chairman of the board.
Yeah, so Parag has been at Twitter for a decade. He's been there a very long time. He's an engineer. He's very smart. He's very technical. He's kind of your classic, Silicon Valley tech guy, right? And some of the things that he's been leading there have been these really long-term looking technical projects. So Blue Sky, for example, is this idea that Jack Dorsey has about decentralizing control over social media. So instead of just one company being able to choose, here are the rules for social media, here's how the algorithms work, it would kind of create a technological solution so that not all that power is held by any one company. And so that is a project that Parag was working on before he became CEO. And so you kind of get this sense that even though Jack Dorsey is stepping away, the person who's filling his shoes is someone who understands a lot of the kind of long-term stuff that Jack was very interested in. And, it's an interesting pick because it's not someone who's very public facing. It's not someone that those of us on the outside of the company see very often, but it is someone who has been there for a really long time and has all of that institutional knowledge. He's not a founder, so there's a little bit of a challenge there when you're taking over someone else's creation. But I do think he is a product person, and it'll be interesting to see what he does with it. Yeah, and of course, he was handpicked by Jack Dorsey. And if Twitter is Jack Dorsey's first love, you feel like there's some continuity there. You had mentioned that Jack Dorsey has been at Twitter for 6 years. He, of course, co-founded the company, and he left for a while in 2008, and then he returned. So, final question to you, Kurt. Is it conceivable that we might see Jack Dorsey again, that this isn't the end of him? Oh my gosh, I'm just trying to imagine the news cycle around, Jack Dorsey's return for a third time. It's not impossible, I would say, because I've decided that nothing is impossible when it comes to Twitter. I do find it very unlikely. At this point, I think Jack is 45 years old. He's obviously extremely wealthy. I think when he came back to Twitter, there was this feeling that he wanted to right the ship. He wanted to kind of get Twitter headed in the right direction again. And, in a lot of ways, he did do that. And so I'm not sure that he has anything to prove in the way that he did when he came back in 2015. So while I don't think it is necessarily impossible, I would say it's probably very unlikely at this stage, just given his age, his focus, his interests, and of course, the fact that I think he kind of accomplished a lot of the things he set out to accomplish when he came back. And so I would be shocked. As shocked as I am that he's leaving, I'd be even more shocked if he were to return someday. Right. Well, at least in this case, he's picking when he's leaving. He's going out on a high, as George Costanza would say. Bloomberg News technology reporter Kurt Wagner, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your instant analysis of the CEO change at Twitter. Jack Dorsey is out, and of course, the Chief Technology Officer, Parag Agrawal, is in.